Right. Well, we're here in the chocolate train, but drinking delicious hot chocolate. Myself, I'm here with Ray Millett, professor of psychology and long-term educator, and very pleased to be able to ask him a few questions about his experience of education. So, hello, Ray.
And hello, Alex.
Just to give a sense to people about where you've arrived at, can you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Gosh, how does one condense all that into a very short conversation? Well, I guess starting with where I am now, and perhaps working backwards a bit. I'm retired. I worked for the health service for 35 years and ran psychology departments both in England and in Scotland. I'm currently an honorary professor at Heriot-Watt and continue to do some lecturing there. But it's interesting that you're asking about your education, because in a sense, I was in education almost by accident rather than by design, in that most of my life has been as a practitioner psychologist, actually dealing face-to-face with clients. And the teaching that I originally got involved in relation to that was mainly training other psychologists, and then gradually branched out from that in a variety of different ways, doing talks on a variety of things to both academic audiences, which is what I continue to do at Heriot-Watt. But also I was particularly interested in conveying something about psychology to public audiences, because for me, psychology was never just an academic subject and never just the job that I did. It was more about being a way of life or a way of understanding life. And I always felt that many of the things which I had learned during my course of training in psychology were things that might well be of interest to a lot of other people. And so I do have a foot in formal education. I certainly have a foot in informal education in various ways. And I guess that's where I am now.
Tell me how you see this word education. It's a big word, and it means a lot of things to different people. I'm interested in how people conceptualize that in relation to their own world.
I think education has meant lots of different kinds of things down through the years. In fact, it was quite interesting because I was working with Scotland's colleges a couple of years ago in their Dangerous Ideas Festival. One of the things they were looking at was, what is education? And really, you can almost see an evolution of education over a period of time. When it started out, the idea of education, and the one which I still really quite like, was it was helping people to be the best that they could be. It was bringing out from people their potential and helping them to realize that potential in a whole variety of ways. And that's essentially what education meant. Then it became formalized in some way and it began to have a purpose. So one of the purposes was to enable people to fit into society. So you educated people about what society expected of them, the appropriate ways to behave. And then that became educating people to work and become workers. So they had to have certain skills in order to fit into the kind of working environment. So education became about that. And to my mind now, education is very much about being a political idea. And it's something which creates sound bites for politicians about how many people we've got going to university and what the passing levels are and hires and A grades and so on. And I kind of feel it's lost some of that original bit about actually looking at the individual and helping the individual to be the best they can be. So one of the things I'm interested in the less formal side of education, clearly when I'm doing things at Heriot-Watt, I have to set exam questions, and that's just part of the game. But what I'm really interested in is helping people to actually think about things and understand themselves and the world in a more constructive way.
This speaks a lot to me from the talks you've done. I've walked away with an interest in psychology, in some of the concepts you've introduced, and you've created a lovely itch, which has meant I've gone away and read more about psychology, and it it always comes to mind. You're looking at the root of the word, the etymology, educare, to draw out. Um, but thinking about our culture here and now, where do you see these opportunities for uh, for people to be nurtured, to be the best that they can be? That
In some ways, I'd like to think that that was going to happen through things like the schools and the education system, but I'm not convinced that it really does anymore, because I think, like a lot of areas of public life, particularly where there are political points to be made, all the people are actually measuring are outcomes of some sort. So they're measuring how many people are in school, how many people are there in the classroom, how many people get hires, this sort of stuff. And I'm not sure that's actually measuring about education in the way in which I think of it. I mean, that's measuring about whether people can pass exams and meet the standards and provide politicians with sound bites. I think a lot of it has to be about helping people to be genuinely more interested in what's happening in the world around them, so that they start asking questions. I always think about, in science, it's often quoted that the important phrase was "Eureka, I found it." And I think, no, actually, the most important thing that people say in science is, "Oh, that's odd," because that starts them questioning, and they then want to try and understand more, and they start to look at the evidence, different ways of understanding things, different ways of looking at topics, and they start thinking. And I would say that my goal in life is to help people to think more. This wonderful phrase that I used to talk to patients about says that never worry about what people are thinking of you. Most of them don't. And people go through life accepting things and perhaps don't always question things or think about things or look behind the curtains to see what's really there. And I like to stimulate that, which is why I do many of the things that I do.
I've noticed that some people struggle to identify that they have a stake in knowledge, that they have knowledge that's valuable, whether it's experience, whether it's a social history, whether it's knowing what's gone in their own familial circumstances. And I worry about people being excluded from larger conversations. The reason I'm thinking about this is you talk about educating for the workforce. This has a bit of a reverse osmosis as well. Well, if it's not serving that purpose, or if I'm not certificated in this area, am I allowed to talk about this? Um, what what what's your experience of people's relationship to knowledge? Uh, owning that process, making meaning in their own life, and being included in larger conversations such as, I mean, the academic world, something we know and love. But is the academic world open to academics? And I'm interested in thinking about that person beyond the formal educational sector that come up with great ideas and want to take part and learn through proximity. So, yeah. To summarize my babble, people's relationship to owning knowledge. Some people feel at odds with the idea of them taking part in something like psychology when they're asked. Yet, like you say, it's every day. So my psychology affords me an opportunity to learn about behavior and this formal discussion about my behavior, our behavior. Um, where where do people find leverage to join you in that discussion of psychology?
I guess part of the answer is that things operate on several different kinds of levels. And it's a bit like if you want to be a car mechanic, people are going to want to deal with somebody who understands how engines work. And that may require a degree of specialist knowledge, specialist training that people have to go through in order to do that. On the other hand, most people can blow up their tires, add water in the radiator, put in some oil, etc., and keep the car ticking over nicely. So there's a level of involvement that they can have at a more mundane level, which enables them to engage with the process of, this is my car, I drive it, I maintain it, up to a point. And I guess any area of specialist knowledge is a bit like that, that there's a level at which people have to have gone through a process of acquiring the basics, if you like, certain standards about how to approach things or understand things, a breadth of knowledge, breadth of understanding. But that doesn't mean that the opinions of people who haven't gone through that are entirely invalid. They may be more limited in some ways, but it doesn't necessarily make them invalid. And certainly as a psychologist, for example, involved in the treatment of patients, the best expert on that patient was often the patient's friend. And yes, I had a set of tools, if you like, enabling me to tell them more about how to maintain the engine. But they were the person driving the car. And they actually had a very good knowledge of what it was like to be that person and to engage on a day-to-day basis with things that actually impacted on them. And I might be helping to extend that knowledge or to help see some of that in a different way. But it didn't mean that their understanding of themselves was in any sense invalid just because they didn't have a doctorate in psychology. And I think a lot of areas are like that if you look at astronomy, for example, clearly there are people who are professional astronomers, but every so often some amateur looks through his telescope and sees something interesting and says, "Oh!" And the next thing you know, that hits the front pages of the paper, amateur discovers new comet or whatever. Because, yes, there are people who spend their lives doing that. That's their work, and that's what they're doing all the time. And maybe they're looking into things with a greater depth or a greater intensity. But that doesn't mean that other people can't come along and offer something here or there that actually helps to understand and expand the field. And that's as true of psychology as anything else.
I do like that quote you produced of Einstein's on his intelligence.
It's not that I'm more intelligent, it's just that I persevere longer.
I find great comfort in that. Yeah. It tells me, well, stick with this. I don't understand today. Invest more time.
Yeah, but I think that's the catch for a lot of people, and that is that their opinions may be perfectly valid, but there's a certain amount of hard work goes into this too. You don't just wake up in the morning and have a sudden brilliant idea and say, wow, I now understand the world and everything in it. There's generally a process you have to go through of actually looking at what's already known, understanding what's possible, beginning to think about different kinds of evidence, etc. And people have to go through that thinking process. And a lot of people don't necessarily do that. They're quite happy just to accept what they're told and to live on that basis. And as I say, part of my aim is to help people think more, to actually ask questions.
So you've been very generous in sharing your knowledge and skills in the community context, and everybody's you've enriched the network here in Edinburgh. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on why when you've got I guess many opportunities to share. Why have you chosen to share in the community?
I mean, in a sense, the difficulty I have answering that is it seems so obvious to me that that's what you would do. I live in the community. I relate to other people. They're not all academics. They're not all psychologists. They're not all university graduates. But I find them fascinating and always have. I mean, through my life, I've lived in all kinds of environments, dealing with all kinds of people. And I guess part of the reason I'm in psychology is because I find people fascinating. And I've found all the people I've dealt with fascinating. Some I've liked very much, some perhaps not quite so much. Everyone has illustrated for me something different about the way in which life can be approached and understood. And therefore, when I'm looking to explore these ideas myself, and part of what I do is, I have to say, it's not necessarily altruistic. I'm sort of self-interested in terms of can I continue my own education? And part of the way of doing that is to share my thoughts and ideas with other people who can come back critically and question what I'm doing or add to what I'm doing. And as well as with Ragged University, that I run the philosophy and psychology group on a monthly basis where we have questions that are generated or topics that are generated by the members of the group. And every month, 25, 30 people sit around and discuss these issues. Some of them are quite tricky, difficult issues. And I always go into that thinking, well, okay, I've done a bit of research beforehand and I know roughly how this might go. And it turns out that's always wrong because somebody comes up with things that I hadn't thought of or a way of asking the question that perhaps I hadn't anticipated. And that expands my understanding and my knowledge. So it's a kind of self-interesting thing. If I don't go out there and share it with people, how am I going to continue to develop? I'll just be stuck with what I already know.
It's a lovely, rich way of seeing the world around you and conceiving of yourself as a living part of it. I like it. I'd like to know about your experience of formal education and, of course, any educational situation. Where we learn outside of these formal settings. What do you feel culture helped enrich your way of looking and seeing?
I guess paradoxically, the most enriching experience of formal education was when I dropped out of it. I had been brought up at school, went to a good school, got good results in my hires, was particularly good at science, and without thinking very much about it, sort of went off to university to do maths and physics. And it didn't take me very long to realize that the kinds of things I was dealing with and the kinds of questions that maths and physics were asking and answering were not really the things I was mostly interested in. That's not to say they weren't interesting, because I think maths and physics and my grounding in these sciences is something I think has always been very useful to me, because it's enabled me to have a kind of formal approach to understanding and learning things, which I wouldn't have had if I hadn't done that. But they weren't answering the questions that I really was interested in at that age. And we're talking about 18, 19, 20, when what intrigued me was how do people work? How does the world work? And it began to dawn on me that physics and maths were not going to answer these questions. So I dropped out of university and spent 3 years living what could broadly be described as a hippie life. So I was living largely for a while on the island of Arran, earning a living, working on farms, working in hotels, playing music, making leather goods, doing all kinds of things. And I met lots of really interesting people there from all kinds of walks of life, many of whom were doing the same sort of thing, had sort of opted out. But it included people like American vets who had been in Vietnam and had gone back to the States afterwards, very often with some sort of injury, and had realised they could live in Scotland more cheaply on their vet allowance than they could in the States, so they came to live somewhere like Arran. And I met people from all over the world who were there, and my horizons just started to open up. And I found myself considering lots of different things about people that I hadn't considered before. I was exposed to various cults like Scientology, and started asking questions about that. And I've still got a letter from L. Ron Hubbard telling me to stop asking awkward questions and get a more subjective reality of the topic. But that's another story. But it was perhaps during that period that I consolidated my notion that the thing I really wanted to study was probably psychology, because that was going to come closer to giving me answers to some of the questions that I was interested in than maths and physics ever would. And to some extent, the rest is history. I went back to Strathclyde University and did my honours degree in psychology and really enjoyed it. I didn't find it hard work doing that degree because I was really interested in everything I was doing. And I did a minor in philosophy at the same time. And so the two is very closely related, that you couldn't really understand psychology without asking philosophical questions. And you couldn't really understand philosophy without understanding something about how people work. And so I then went on to do clinical psychology. And again, I found that in some respects really easy because it fitted with what I really wanted to know. So I guess, one of my main things about education and the formal aspects of education was the first requirement is you've got to be really interested in what you're doing. And if you are, it's not like hard work. I mean, there's hard work involved, but it's interesting work. So you're committed to it already. And I think for a lot of people, that's what they've got to find. They've got to find what is they're really interested in, so that what they're studying is not just hard work to earn a degree, but is actually meaningful to them in some other way.
Oh, this makes so much sense to me. I enjoy finding people who love what they do. They make the details endlessly interesting. I find that they've thought about so many aspects of their subject that I as somebody maybe who hasn't invested the same time in, they've got that rich knowledge and enjoy sharing it. I find the social aspect of learning pivotal for me, and I I wonder whether my years in formal education might have been a bit better, or I might have done better if there were more social interactions going on. I never fared well with these examination, hard series of examinations. Have you read this? Well, I'd like you to respond this way and not this way. Don't be lateral, Alex. Which I heard a few times.
I think to some extent, as I say already, it depends whether you're doing something that you're actually interested in. And if you are, and you're doing it for its own sake rather than something to pass the exam, that makes a big difference. But I think personal style is a big factor too. I mean, when I was doing my psychology degree at Strathclyde, I was talking to one of the lecturers after I'd just been sitting the exams, and I was saying that when I sit exams, the trouble is I can never remember all the references and things, and I can never put down the names and the dates of all the people who said whatever it was they'd said. He said, "Yes, we know that about you, Miller." He said, "But you always grasp the idea." And that seemed to me to be very important. And now when I mark exams myself, as I do at Heriot-Watt, I'm less interested in whether somebody has been able to quote all the right references as whether they're showing me evidence that they've really understood what they're writing about and grasped the idea. Because at the end of the day, if you want to know what the reference was, you can go and look it up. But you've got to have had the idea first. And the idea has got to be in the right ballpark before you know which references to go and look at. And so for me, that's always been the important thing. Are people actually thinking about things? Are they understanding the concept? And the detail of that is something they can fill in later. I always say that an expert is somebody who, if you ask them to guess, will generally guess in the right ballpark. And I think that the expert doesn't necessarily know everything, but they know enough to know roughly where the answer is going to be. And I think that's what I want to encourage in other people. They don't know every aspect of the detail, but they've got an overall grasp that tells them where to go and look.
Well, this might be a bit of a funny, silly question, but I like silly questions.
Good.
What do you enjoy most about teaching?
Well, in some ways, as I've already said, I enjoy the idea that I'm encouraging people to think and perhaps shaking up some of their preconceptions about things. What I really enjoy is when I get feedback and people come up and say, "Hey, that was really interesting. I never thought of that." So, gosh, that's made me think about, because that's what I want to do. I want them to think about whatever it is they're thinking about. So recently, for example, I just finished doing some lectures at Heriot Watt on health psychology, and one of the students sent me an email saying, "You made me start thinking about stigma and mental health. I really would like to do my research project on stigma and mental health. Where can I look at stuff about that?" And that wasn't specifically something I'd been teaching on, but I'd sort of touched on it as I went through other things. And obviously this had clicked with them, and they thought, here's potentially an interesting area, an interesting idea that's worth looking at. So I'd encourage them to do that. To answer your phone.
No. Generally, I have the ringer turned off. But
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, any kind of feedback like that, where I can get some evidence that people have been influenced in some way or thought more deeply about things in some way as a result of the teaching that I do.
What would you like people to understand about the role that you take on when you're trying to develop that? I like that the question of or the task of my trying to understand what the other person's experience is on the other side of the gelato counter. There might be something that I've fundamentally missed. Like, oh well, sometimes when four people are talking to you at once, it's hard to get the orders right. So I think it's a valuable question. What would you like people to understand about your job when you're acting in the role of educator?
I guess I would say I'd like them to understand that it's a dialogue. I think that very often when you're teaching in some way or educating in some way, you're put up there as an expert, and people assume you're going to give them all the answers. And I don't quite see it that way, because I guess the old saying is that the wise person knows that they know nothing. And I'm very aware that there are lots of things that I don't know or that I'm inadequately informed about. And that therefore the notion that people can come along and challenge me or ask me further questions about things and turn it into a dialogue rather than simply a monologue lecture, that it's a two-way process, that I'm learning from the questions they ask as much as they're learning from the answers that I give. So I think that's probably what I would like to people to realise when I'm engaged in that kind of process.
Oh. And in these formal rules, of course, we're living in a collective society. We find ways of organising ourselves in group ways. These often involve administrative systems and paperwork and bureaucracies. What's your experience of paperwork and bureaucracy? Have these facilitated you in achieving the jobs for which you've been hired to fulfill?
Well, one of the things about the soundtrack is it can't capture the sort of spit and the cross. But I mean, I think that bureaucracy is a necessary evil up to a point. I think that certainly you have to be able to account for what you do, and in many of the areas that I do work, not just in terms of education, but many of the other things I'm involved in, it's necessary to have a kind of audit trail that shows that you've been doing something and what you've been doing has been worthwhile, that it's actually had an appropriate outcome. And working in the health service, it was certainly important, for example, that you showed that what you were doing was value for money, for example, that taxpayers are putting their money into the system and they're expecting something back out of that, and demonstrating that that's the case is important. I think the difficulty for me is when bureaucracy becomes one of two things. One is it becomes an end in itself, and you're filling in paperwork just because it's a good idea to fill in paperwork. And it has a tendency to multiply. So you fill in a form to show why you filled in another form that was actually about the third form. And you think, for heaven's sake, this is getting ludicrous. But the other thing I referred earlier on is it's the notion of education becoming a political football. And I think one of the dangers is that a lot of bureaucracy is there because people want to be able to produce sound bites from data. And very often it's inaccurate sound bites from incomplete and inaccurate data. And very often bureaucracy is measuring things that are inappropriate to measure, measuring them inaccurately and drawing wrong conclusions from them. So I think, there's a balance here. I'm not saying no bureaucracy, because I recognize accountability in anything you do is an important factor. But I think one has to be cautious that the bureaucracy doesn't actually take over. And as an example, one of the reasons I retired slightly early, I retired a year earlier than I could have done. Well, actually, I retired. I didn't complete all the years, have a full pension. I missed 1 year. And one of the reasons I retired was I was sitting in my office one day thinking, here I am with 35 years of experience of dealing with really difficult clients and really difficult psychological problems. And how am I spending 3/4 of my time? I'm spending it on a computer filling in forms that a secretary could fill in. And I think they're paying me a lot of money to sit here and do something which is completely irrelevant in terms of my skill set. And I'm not actually using the skills which I do have to their best value and effect. And I thought, this is just nonsense. I thought, now's the time to get out.
This is very poignant. I think I'm always interested how we all encounter these questions. A list is a great basis for organisation, but then compulsive itineraries really start to become cumbersome. Yeah, it's becoming a bigger and bigger feature in everybody's lives. And I am interested in the vocational, like say, that's 35 years of rich and rare experience. Why on earth would would we not want to tap into that and have these other tasks dealt with uh, by other people? But so I'm interested in your thoughts on how we, everybody can contribute to opening out educational opportunities in our landscape, and how we might start approaching valuing knowledge outside of these formal settings. Do you have any thoughts on what might be a good addition?
I suppose one could say that the easy answer is that we need more things like the Ragged University and the Philosophy and Psychology group. There need to be opportunities out there for people to engage with things in non-formal contexts. I think alongside that there's got to be something about the way in which a lot of things are actually taught, even within the formal context, actually making them accessible and understandable rather than simply a way of passing exams and getting a qualification. Part of my aim has been to really try and find as many opportunities as I can. And I do things like Ragged University, I do things like my group, I do things like Education for the Workers' Education Association. And part of that has been really about my responsibility to say yes when people ask me if I can do something for them. So I think if I have these skills, then part of the responsibility is to share these skills. And I think encouraging more people to do that in more ways, in more settings, it really has to be the way forward. I think the difficulty is, I would say this particularly about things like my group at the Ragged University, there's a risk that you're actually preaching to the converted. But the people who are going to come along to these kinds of things are people who already think it would be a good idea to learn more about things. And how you reach the harder to reach people, I'm not sure I have an answer to that really, except that every opportunity that's there, say yes and try to make it work. Some of them will work, some of them won't.
I wonder what your thoughts on. I return to this idea of stakeholdership, ownership in knowledge. So let's cast a thought experiment. Now I set out to create a contention in psychology and write using references and also incorporating personal experience about an issue in psychology. Now I write, say, 20-page essay. Um, how can that possibly find a place in the dialogue that you spoke about? Where I mention this because I feel that if somebody's invested, if I've got something to gain, if I gain a community, a place in a wider circle of peers, there's something valuable that I'm a part of that value, and I'll invest more time in it. Um, and I've met lots of people who follow. I was told about the statistic MD20 apparently. Was a demographic.
Mm-hmm.
And people write and pour their passions into great work. You know, I'm thinking of a big piece of literature in creative sciences, in creative arts, but also in sciences. I've come across a guy who wrote a tome on genetics because he loved reading budgerigars. I wonder about. I wonder whether there might be some truth in at the moment that our formalized society starts valuing these works outside of, say, a £9,000 fee, the harder to reach groups might draw towards the learning communities, the networks. What do you think this?
I think it's difficult because no matter how good an idea is, no matter how useful an idea is, it's not going to reach everybody unless there are advocates for it in some way who are actually spreading the word. And historically, you look at things like religions or cults, they didn't suddenly happen because one guy had a good idea. They happened because there were lots of disciples who went off and spread the word. And in a sense, the same is going to be true for any idea. I'm not particularly advocating religion as a model, but all these things. I guess the equivalent nowadays would be something going viral on the internet. Something is put up there, and 2 or 3 people grab it and spread it, and before you know where you are, it's spreading like wildfire everywhere, and people tack onto that idea. How you achieve that, I think, to some extent, you can do a certain amount of that by putting yourself out there and encouraging people to listen to what you're saying and hoping that they will go on and spread some of that elsewhere. I think some of it's accidental. You certainly look at some of them that go viral on the internet. Nobody expected that they would, like the guy who was singing opera on the train from Glasgow the other night. Just suddenly got several hundreds of thousands of people looking at the video that somebody recorded on their iPhone. So I think you can only actually make the effort. You can't guarantee that these things are always going to get out there. And I say the risk is that they will reach most easily the people that are ready to listen. I guess for me, one of the things that I really enjoyed about being a psychologist, seeing patients face to face for 35 years, was that you had the opportunity to work with that person as an individual and to find out what their potential was, what their capability of looking at life differently might be, and helping them to realize that potential more fully. And I think at the end of the day, for some of these people, that was the only way it could have been done, because they weren't going to engage with any formal system. Many of them had rejected formal systems. And that the only thing that was actually going to be meaningful to them was something that was tailored very specifically to their own individual situation and identity. How you do that on a massive scale, I really don't know.
Thinking about psychology, of course, how do we measure the impact of it? As an anecdote of my life, I recall being a very young child, and I was crying about something. And then somebody bought me the colouring book that I wanted and sort of calmed me down. But that act of kindness took about 20 years to manifest. I remember decades later, sitting and meditating on that single moment. And that actually bringing me right into the libraries, a passion for finding out more. But I wonder whether that teacher handed a piece of paper at the end of the day. What impact have you made on Alex? It's very hard to say. And have you got thoughts on how we can tell?
I think a lot of the time it's not going to be easy to measure these kinds of things. That's one of the reasons why I'm saying that bureaucracy often measures the wrong kinds of things or give answers that aren't particularly meaningful, because some of these things are not necessarily going to appear in terms of their consequences within a relatively short time scale. Again, just from clinical experience, one of the examples was that I would be seeing people and I would maybe see them for 10 or 15 sessions. And in the 15 sessions, we were sort of winding up, saying, well, everything seems to have improved, and you're getting on better now. And they would say to me, yeah, it was that thing you said in session 2 that made the difference. And I think, what the hell was that? And they would come out with something, and I'd have forgotten perhaps that I'd even said it. But at the time, it obviously clicked with them, and it changed the way in which they were understanding the situation or understanding themselves, and became the grain and seed from which things then grew. And I think a lot of life is like that. That you don't always know which of the things you're doing is actually the thing that's going to have an effect. And so my answer to that is very often to have a kind of shotgun approach. You fire off pellets in all directions, and hopefully some of them hit. And you can't necessarily say which hit, but what you know is if you hadn't fired the shotgun, none of them would have hit. I think that very often measuring outcomes is a bit like that. You can say, I don't know exactly what it was that I did that had the outcome, but I know that if I had done nothing, there'd have been no outcome. And that's the difficulty about bureaucracy, that it looks for a straight line connection between these things, and it's not always a straight line.
So we've covered quite a lot. I'm thinking about learning and teaching and big word education. Is there anything that you feel is less talked about than it should be?
There are lots of things I could pick on, but if I was going to pick on one, I would say that I think that the current education system values only a particular kind of education, and it's an education that's geared to things like passing exams and getting qualifications. Certainly politically, it's an education system that's been geared towards people going to university and very much about things like university education. For me, the thing that's really missing and has been missing for a long time now is practical education. People learning not so much to read books and know things in an abstract way, but learning how to do things and have practical skills and be competent. Because for a lot of people's lives, that's what they're fundamentally actually going to need. They're going to need things that help people live a day-to-day life, to do a day-to-day job, and to do that effectively and satisfactorily. And passing an exam is not necessarily a way to show that people have achieved that. So I think, I'm very interested in the idea that we should be looking more at training people in practical as well as academic skills. We should be looking more at models like apprenticeships rather than people going necessarily into university and further education. And I think it's not that higher and further education isn't valuable. I think it is, but I don't think we can assume that it's going to be valuable for everybody. People are different, and that some people will have a different set of needs that are going to be best met in other kinds of ways, and we've kind of ignored that because all the sound bites are about how many people go to university. That's good for politicians, but not necessarily good for the individual.
Great. Well, I thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time.
It's a pleasure.
I
especially enjoyed the hot chocolate.
yeah, delicious. Cheers.
Okay.